Bachelors Begin Again, Part 2. It was well past sunset, and the bachelor pack boys sat on the floor of Alicia's living room, while Alicia, Mitz, and Trinskall sat on the chairs and couch, all dozing lazily. Dason had left to walk Nikon home, leaving the rest of them sleepy as they let their large meal of pasta and meatballs settle in their distended bellies. "Thank you for the food, Alicia," Balin finally said with a heavy sigh. The eldest bachelor sat up from between the couch and the coffee table to lean his back against the couch and look back at Alicia. The young woman was stretched out on the couch, with her feet propped up on the armrest and her head on a couple stacked pillows. It's nothing. I don't have people here often. I usually pawn myself off on others, so it was a nice change." She smiled warmly, ignoring the laugh from Mitz. The large man shifted in his chair, then, with a loud groan, stood up and stretched. I better get home. I have to go back to INKARNATE tomorrow," he said softly as he looked at the clock on the wall. Alicia stood up from her seat and walked with Mitz to the hallway. The bachelors watched her, curious, but RSA sat up tall, his ears pricked as he inspected them. "Be careful. Come back in one piece, all right, Mitz?" Alicia said softly, her voice warm but a little pained. RSA frowned. From what she had told them so far, she had been their general in the military, which explained why she would worry about them. "I will, General. I always do." The large man smiled as he quickly and gently hugged Alicia, making her smile and shove him away. Mitz looked back into the living room, a large smile still on his face. "I expect you guys to take good care of this woman." His voice was strong, but teasing, as he pointed to each of the vargin. Trin snorted as he stretched out in his chair, but the bachelors laughed softly, amused by his assigned, even mock responsibility. Niland scooted across the floor as Alicia and Mitz traded a few more words, and put his head in his brother's lap. RSA jumped slightly, but only glanced down at his brother for a brief moment before raising his gaze to watch Alicia and her former soldier. "Brother," Tay said softly. Say didn't pay him any attention. Didn't even twitch an ear at his brother's words. "Brother," Niland said again, as he lightly tugged at Say's shirt sleeve. Still, nothing. Alicia stayed in the entryway of the living room until the sound of the front door closing echoed through the small home. Only then did she turn and lightly jump back over the couch and into her lounging position. "Brother!" Tay continued, this time poking Say in the chest with one finger. "What?" RSA smiled and laughed in an annoyed manner as he looked down at his twin brother. Niland smiled, but put on a pouting face as he tried to hold back his laughter. "Never mind. I don't want to talk to you if you're going to be like that." The dusty-haired man sat up. Say laughed, shoved his brother back as he moved away, causing him to dramatically topple forward. "Be good, Tay. Say," Balin said softly as he let out a yawn. Niland glanced at Say and stuck his tongue out as he settled with his back against one of the chairs. Moki let out a heavy yawn and rolled over, his head still resting in Balin's lap and his eyes growing heavier and heavier. Balin mindlessly played with Moki's hair as the youngest vargin started to drift off. Lunsen, who was leaning on the same chair as Tay, slowly, almost as if his limbs were made of rubber, climbed awkwardly into the chair and laid in it sideways with his knees curled over one arm. "You seem close to Sir Mitz," RSA finally spoke up. Alicia and Bay both looked at RSA, a bit surprised by him speaking up all of a sudden. Alicia's face softened, and she smiled, as if thinking about some distant memory. "Yeah, we've been through a lot together. He, Dason, Trin, and my brother Nix, we became a pack after my banishment. Of course, we now have Nikon and Riska, and our pack has grown, but..." She smiled and looked at Trin, who was watching the fire with glassy eyes. Trenny. she said softly, making Trin turn and look at her with a raised brow. Go home and go to bed. Trinskall huffed slightly as he turned his head back to the fire. Trinskall, you haven't been feeling well. You need to go home and go to bed. Trin let out a growl as he let his head flop back against the back of the chair. Fine, bitch, he muttered as he stood up and grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. Alicia rolled her eyes at the red-haired man as he looked around at each of the bachelors. His gaze narrowed, but he snorted and walked out without another word to any of them. He's a cheery one, Talon said, with a soft chuckle. Alicia stretched as she heard the front door shut again. He just takes his job way too seriously, she responded. It's hard to get out of the Skalat mindset. I understand. But... Talon's nose wrinkled as he thought about what he was trying to say. He won't be happy if he doesn't lighten up a bit, he finally said. Alicia nodded. Trust me, I know. He doesn't understand, or he refuses to understand. The young woman rolled onto her side, her face showing contentment as she watched her new companions. So, I haven't heard what brought all of you together, she said softly as she glanced at the now softly sleeping Moki. Balin smiled and sighed. Well, where do you want us to start? He asked. Start with you, I guess, she said as she sat back up, interested. Even Lunson sat up as Balin started to find his words. The bachelors had been together for a couple of years now, but they never really spoke about their pasts before they met up. I guess... Balin sighed as he adjusted his seating, which made Moki roll onto his belly and wrap one arm around Bay's leg. The youngster let out a heavy sigh as he fell into a deeper slumber. Well, it was that first winter after you were proclaimed dead. Balin shivered as he sat in the snow, watching the pack boundaries. No Fellet had been seen in months, so he was still uncertain as to why he was helping with extra guard duty. Then again, ever since Alphys Matsi was murdered, the young male sighed as his eyes lowered to the snow under his paws. The pack was already in chaotic shambles under the rule of their new leader, but there was nothing he could do. Alpha female Solera wouldn't even let them leave to go get help from the other world allies like Yarnet, Tarlin, or any of the other tribes in their own world. What was the point of him training the next generation of worldly advisors if they were not going to be jumping to other worlds? In fact, he hadn't even seen any of his 3 apprentices since the fall of Matsi. Each of them had been sent back to their home packs, supposedly only temporarily. Balin had his doubts. Now, though, the new High Alpha female was blocking off trade, even with the other smaller tribes. Why would she do such a thing? It would certainly mean death to the smaller migratory packs. Crunching of snow made Balin turn to see 3 High Alpha Scards walking towards him. Balin Thalors, worldly advisor to the former Alphys Matsi. One of the guards, a large, black-marked vargin with tan undercoat, said with a growling voice. Balin stood, his hair starting to stand on end. He could feel his stomach sinking as he started to suspect what was coming next. You have been sentenced to banishment by High Alphys Solera under the charge of insubordination. The large mountain-born guard let out a smile and a growl as his 2 partners laughed and bared their fangs to the smaller, deer-marked male. Returning or failing to leave the Vargin lands is punishable by death. Balin took the hint and turned on his heels to flee towards the pack borders. Within a few strides, though, the sound of the 3 other sets of paws in the snow echoed. No, 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 he thought to himself as he tried to think of the best way to escape. He could see 2 of the guards pulling out to the sides in an attempt to cut him off. Wings! Wings, I can fly out of here! He suddenly remembered. He was never the best at flying, and in fact he hated it. But this was not the time to be picky. He spread his wings, ready to take flight. Snap, snap! He let out a yelp as snares tightened around his left paws, making him stumble and tangle himself in his own wings, legs, and snare ropes. Blood stained the snow as the snares tightened and he struggled to get himself free. But no matter what he did, it was too little, too late. Two of the large guards strode up to him from the sides as their lead approached him, head held high. He stopped, a few feet from him, laughing, but silenced at the sound of more approaching paws. The three guards stopped and lowered their heads as the alpha female's head guard stopped forward. Balin's heart skipped. "Papa!" he whimpered at the old graying male vargin. The brown and gray male stood with his head high, his golden eyes narrow as he looked down at the tangled mess of his eldest son. By order of Alpha Solera, all banished regal bloods are to be grounded, Bayard said strongly. No, please, just let me go. I won't come back. Please, father. Balin begged as the two guards behind him shifted into their hominid forms and started to wrangle him to the ground. Balin let out snarls, cries, and yells as he struggled against the restraints of the guards. Go ahead, Thelio. Remember, release him afterwards, Bayard said strongly before turning and walking back the way he came. The large black vargin nodded to his guard leader, smiled, showing off his large fangs as he strode to Balin. The large black vargin shoved Balin's head into the snow under one paw and held open one of the male's wings with the other. Balin went numb as he felt teeth grip at the base of his wing. Snap! Balin let out a howl as the shattering snap echoed through him. His side went warm as blood started to pool around him, but the pain was like fire in his shoulders. The guards rolled him over, laughing, and Bay gave up fighting. His golden eyes looked helplessly at his dismembered wing that bled in the snow a few feet away. Snap! The second break went almost unnoticed by the deer-marked male. He was already too numb. The guard tossed aside his second wing, then removed the embedded snares from his legs before starting to walk away. Balin just stayed there, his eyes still locked on his wing. He could feel his own blood melting the snow around him and seeping into his coat, but he couldn't feel the pain, nor the will to move away from more harm. Leave him. If he's still alive in the morning, you can take care of him. Bayard's voice reached Balin's ears, making him clench his eyes shut tightly. When Balin opened his eyes again, it was night. The pain in his back woke him, as did the chill that was seeping deep into his bones. Slowly, he rolled to his belly and looked around. There wasn't a soul around, just him and his broken wings. He had to get away from here. The fight in the young male's chest started to spark again. He forced himself to his feet. His first step sent him falling face first into the snow again. After inspecting his left legs, he cursed. The tendons and muscles were almost severed by snares. No, it didn't matter. He had to get away. He had to keep fighting. Just like High Alphas Ebenara always told the pups, keep fighting, for even when it looks dark, a star of hope will glimmer through. He muttered to himself as he forced himself to his feet a second time. Despite the pain and lack of movement on his left side, he trekked forward through the snow. It took weeks for the wounds inflicted on him to heal, and he never regained full movement capabilities. Despite this, he continued to fight and to live. For a year, he wandered just outside the pack territories, avoiding all other vargin. It was late summer. When he woke in early morning, something stirred him awake. And once he was up, he was uncertain of what it was. His ears perked up at the sound of a scratchy cry echoing through the trees of the forest he was residing in. Slowly, he wandered through the undergrowth, following the cry. Raven? No. Crow? No, it's not a bird, he muttered to himself as he tried to decide what the cry was being created by. He pushed past a berry bush and stopped. Stumbling through the underbrush, a small, black and gray vargin pup stumbled. From its young maw, it cried help, and "I'm over here" in the vargin tongue. then would let out a whimper and cry. Balin stayed back, watching, assessing. The pup was thin, his ribs poking through his coat, and his fur was matted and dirty. Balin's heart was breaking as he watched the pup cry, trying to navigate through the thick underbrush of the forest. No, he couldn't leave him like that. "Are you all right?" he asked as he pushed his own way through the bushes. The pup hesitated, watching him with wide, startled eyes, but then bounded towards him and pushed his face into Balin's legs as he let out cries. Balin shifted into his hominid form and sat down in the dirt as he pulled the black pup up against his chest. The young pup trembled as he tried to bury himself further into Balin's chest. "I've got you, little one. Hush," Balin said as he tried to comfort the little thing. Bay sat there, petting the pup, for quite some time before the little thing calmed down and started to relax. "Do you have a name?" he asked the pup in their native tongue. The pup thought for a moment, but shook his head. "Do you know who your parents are, or what they look like?" Once again, the pup shook his head. "I don't remember anyone," he said in a squeaky voice. Balin ran his hand over the head of the pup, sighing heavily. Chances were that the pup's parents were outcasts or renegades, and either left him to die or had been separated during some type of attack. Taking the pup to any of the main packs would likely just result in him being killed for his parents' crimes. "You don't remember your name at all?" Balin asked again as he stood up with the pup still in his arms. The pup shook his head as he wiggled closer to Balin's chest again. "Then I will give you a new pup name," Balin said as he turned to walk back to his current place of residence. The pup looked at him, eyes bright. "You are going to be... Well, I will be your family until we can find you a real one," Balin said as he moved slowly. The pup beamed up at him, excited and safe-feeling. Balin sighed as he pet Makota's head, a tear drooping from his cheek. "I named him Ravencry for his god-awful sounds he made that day." He laughed slightly. "He was 10 years old when he shifted into this form for the first time, and I gave him his new name of Makota." Alicia smiled as she wiped a tear from her own cheek. "Then, 2 years ago, we met Lunson, and that was the start of our little pack." He smiled as he looked at his packmates. They were all silent for a moment. We didn't know any of that, Mama," RSA sighed softly as he looked at their eldest member. "We always assumed Moki was your brother or a nephew," Talon added, as he smiled. Balin smiled and shrugged. "Well, you've done a good job, Balin," Alicia said as she reached over and put her hand on the young man's head. He smiled and inhaled deeply. He wouldn't admit it, but having her say that meant the world to him. There were so many times since he had been banished that he thought about giving up. He had often thought about how the Bachelor Pack didn't need him, but to hear someone else tell him he was making a difference, well, that stoked the fire. "Lunson, I think you should go next, since you were the first one to join Moki and me." Balin smiled at Lune, making the dark-haired man shift slightly. He knew Lunson was not the most comfortable with storytelling, despite being quite good at it. Lune looked down at Talon. "Come on, Lune," Tay encouraged, as he lightly put his arm on his companion's legs. Lune nodded and cocked his head as he thought about where to start. "I do not remember much before I was adopted by the Omegas of Central Valley," he started, his voice holding a dreamy tone to it. "But I guess it all really started just before Solera took over the tribes." Lunson walked quietly behind one of the females that had taken him in. His arms were loaded with pelts, and she led him towards the market square of the nearby human town. It was his first time in town of the humans, and he honestly was excited, but he was uneasy as well. No one wanted to come with him to town to help sell the pelts, and instead, the elder female was the only one helping him, and he was certain she wouldn't stay around all day. Which meant he would be alone. Again. The young male let out a heavy sigh as he adjusted the pelts in his arm and stopped just behind the old woman. "Here, set up here, Lunsen," she said sternly as she dropped the mat she was carrying and started to unroll it. The moment the mat was unrolled, Loon dropped the pelts to the mat and started to organize them by quality and type of fur. "Stay here until the pelts are sold. Remember that," the old woman said sternly as she grabbed Loon by the chin, making him look at her. "Okay, Rhea," he said softly as he nodded against her hand. She aggressively released him, fixed a few of the pelts, then turned and walked back in the direction they had come. Loon watched her go, a bit mournfully. Why did he have to be left alone? Especially in a human-infested town. Of course, there were many vargin and other races milling about the market, which put him a bit more at ease. Maybe he would be all right. The sun was just starting to sink behind the horizon line, and Lunsen sat on his sail mat, a few pelts still sitting in front of him. He let out a yawn and looked around. People were starting to leave the market for the night, and the tavern just on the far side of the square was getting more and more noisy. The scent of a fire roasting food reached his nose and made his mouth water with hunger. The young male let out a heavy sigh as he looked down at the pelts. Rhea told him he couldn't come back with any pelts, and he had to have coin from the sales. If he didn't, then he wouldn't get pay or food or for at least the next 2 nights. His stomach grumbled, and he looked back towards the tavern. "Hey!" A voice made him jolt awake and look around, slightly panicked. The moon was high in the sky, and the street around him was empty, except for a man kneeling in front of him. After a quick glance over him, Lunsen noticed he was a vargin, but he smelled like the ocean with summer fruits. He cocked his head to the side, his eyes adjusted to look at the vargin man. His skin was tanned but fair, with rosy cheeks and a broad, almost contagious smile. "I think you fell asleep," the vargin man said happily, laughing in tone. Lunsen looked around again, and he took a deep breath. "Why don't you go home?" The man stood up and offered a hand to Loon. Loon hesitated, but reached up and took it and let himself be pulled to his feet. "I'm not supposed to go home until all the pelts are sold," he said slowly as he started to fold the remaining skins up and stack them neatly. The other vargin picked up a few pelts and started folding them neatly as well. "Then stay at the inn. You shouldn't just sit out here in the dark." He chuckled softly as his violet and ruby eyes looked Lunsen over. "I did not bring my own coin. I will stay here until I can sell more in the morning," Lunsen said with a head nod. The other vargin blinked and sighed as he looked behind him. "Young Alphys Irti is in bed," he muttered. Lunsen looked at him, wondering if he was talking to himself or if he was supposed to respond in some way. "Come on, we'll put your stuff in my room and go get food at the tavern." The large smile returned to the other vargin's face as his eyes brightened. Loon felt a small smile on his lips as he looked up at the man. "But I do not—" Loon was cut off. "My treat. I need someone to sit with." Lunsen smiled more. It had been a long time since he felt his own lips stretch into a smile like this, and it made him feel giddy. "I am Talin Flora Oralis, Skelet of Coastal Pack Future Alphys Irti." The vargin man stood up and slightly bowed his head to Lunsen in respect. Loon was slightly overwhelmed. A Skelet? Why would a Skelet want to even sit with someone like him? He hesitated, now unsure of himself. I'm Lunsen Virilis," he said slowly, his eyes lowering. "Omega, apprentice of skinning and tanning," he said, his voice trailing off slowly. Talon cocked his head to the side, still smiling slightly. "It is an honor to meet you, Lunsen." Loon looked back up at Talon as the dusty-haired man grabbed the sail mat and a few skins. "Now come on, I'm hungry," he said happily, his eyes glimmering. Loon paused, but then hurried to pick up the rest of the skins and follow Talon. Talon bought them both large meals with drinks, as if it were nothing. Loon was still hesitant, even as Talon pushed plates of food for him. "Eat, my friend," he said happily as he shoved a roll into his mouth. "But no, rank does not apply here. Here, we are friends," Talon said warmly, his face going stern for a moment. Loon eventually accepted the food. Soon, the young, black-haired vargin was stretched in his seat, more stuffed than he could remember ever being. Across the table, Talon told him about the coastal pack and his job as Skalat. It was interesting him, for he often wondered what higher ranks did in daily life. "What is your alpha female like? I have heard from Irti that she is brutal, but kind," Talon asked as he leaned across the table with interest. Loon shrugged. "I've never actually seen her," he said. Talon frowned. "Rhea and the other elder Omegas do not let me go to the center of the Packlands with them, and no one will go with me to the festivals, so I do not go." Loon shrugged as he explained with indifference. "So you don't see her," Talon said softly. Loon nodded as he selfishly shoveled another roll into his mouth. Why are you such an outcast?" Talon asked. Loon paused as he noticed Talon's hesitation. Slowly he lowered his gaze. "I was found. My parents were apparently renegades, killed by Felits," he explained. "I do not remember much, but it left scars?" He cocked his head slightly as he struggled with his own words. Talon frowned more, and Loon could see his shoulders rise and fall with a sigh. "I cannot see on my left side, so I cannot hunt, and I think the other crafters are afraid of me," he finally admitted. Why did he feel so comfortable telling Talon this? Talon shook his head, but then smiled. "Don't let 'em fool ya. They're just jealous," he said happily. Loon smiled wildly and laughed. "You think?" "I know it." Over the next couple of years, Loonson would see Talon whenever his alphas would visit in the valley, and the Black Vargin counted down the days to the big festivals that typically meant Talon would be in the area. Even as he became more and more secluded, more different in behavior, he kept his head up, waiting for his companion to visit. One summer, though, the torment from the other Omegas started to escalate. Meal times were getting less and less frequent for Loon, and even the chance to work was soon eliminated. Sure, the former alpha female had been overthrown, but that didn't mean he would have to be treated different, did it? He started to spend more and more time away from the main pack area, away from all the torment. One night, he was wandering a bit further than normal, watching the path that Talon and the coastal pack members often took when coming into the valley, when he noticed two vargin walking along the tree line. Loon was hit with curiosity. They moved as if they were trying to stay hidden, which meant they were not meant to be around the area. He shrugged, and, sticking to the shadows where his black coat blended in, made his way forward to cut off the two he had been watching. "Who are you?" he asked quietly as he got closer. Both of the unknown males jumped violently, caught by surprise. Loon cocked his head, confused. He hadn't meant to scare them, really. The brown, deer-marked male suddenly turned towards him, teeth bared and snarls echoing from his chest. The younger, black-pelted male stood back, his head low in a growl. "Are you leaving here?" The brown male quieted a bit as he looked Loon over, but still didn't say anything. "Are you going to the coast?" The brown male completely silenced, and his head rose up a bit. "I'm waiting for my friend, and I want to go to the coast with him, where I won't be forgotten anymore," Loon said slowly as he looked to the path that the coastal pack walked. The brown male looked at the path, then back at him. "You want to leave the valley?" the brown male asked softly. Loon nodded, but then shook his head. "Not without Talon," he said after a moment of thinking. Arase's brother?" The brown male muttered to himself as his face scrunched in thought. Arase? Yes, that was Talon's brother's name. He remembered him telling that. Yes, he will come back here for the autumn festival. I'm waiting for him, Loon said happily. The brown male smiled slightly and nodded. We are not heading that direction until spring, but if you want to join us. The black male stepped forward to stand even with the brown male as he offered Loonson a place in the group. No, I mean... Loon paused. I want to find Niland first. Then, maybe, he said with a nod. The brown male nodded and looked towards the hill behind Loon. We will be near the coast in the spring. If you change your mind, meet us there. Without another word, the brown male motioned to his companion, and they took off at a run. Loon turned to look at the hill that the brown male had just been looking at, and noticed a few guards with welcome lanterns. Did that mean... Loon ran up the hill to get a better view, only to see a small caravan of the coastal pack coming for the festival. By the time the festival ended and the coastal pack packed up to leave, Loonson and Niland had developed a plan to get him to the coastal packlands without any questions. I wish to hire him as a tanner for my family, Niland had explained to Irti. Irti was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to the idea, though she acted like she could see through Niland's lie. No one else questioned the Skalat and his new companion, and for the first time in, well, ever, Loon felt free. As he walked behind Niland and the coastal alpha, tanning gear on his back, he felt like he was starting over. Loonson had been out with a hunting party, field prepping skins during the early spring. When he returned to the main pack, he found Niland and his brother discussing something quietly. He did his best to stay away from Niland's family, for fear of crossing a line with Niland, which caused him to hesitate moving further. That, and never had seen Niland so angry looking. Usually, it was he that was angry and grumpy, not Tay. He was like the sun, always beaming. Niland, he finally spoke softly, interrupting RSA. Niland wheeled around, but then relaxed and let a heavy sigh escape him as he motioned for Loon to join them. Loon shook his head. I smell of tanning oils and... Come here, Loonson, RSA said sharply. Loon's hair stood on end, and he was suddenly on edge, but he obeyed. I was relieved of the rank of Skalat, Niland said softly, acid still in his voice. Under what charges? Loon asked quickly, shocked by the news. For my not being loyal to the High Alpha Solera, he said, hate in his voice. RSA was glaring at the little fire they had set around, his own eyes like daggers. First RSA, now me. I get the feeling we're not welcome here anymore, Niland said softly as he ran his hand through his hair. What are you wanting to do? Niland looked over at Loon as he spoke, but then shrugged. I don't know. There isn't much we can do. Bite down and take it, RSA said softly. Loonson looked at the fire as he thought. It was early spring. That renegade. What if we joined a renegade group? Loonson asked. Niland's and RSA's heads popped up quickly, and they looked at him with shock. Leave our packs? Say asked, his voice sharp. Loon shrugged. There was this male I met when I was still in the valley. I did not catch his name, but he offered me to join him and his companion. They travel this direction in the spring. We could join them, Loon explained slowly and coolly. Who was it? Tay asked, which made Loon shrug. I didn't catch his name, but he was copper-colored with fawn marks and bad scars on his shoulders. Niland's face went to shock, and his head snapped to look at RSA. Say's jaw dropped open slightly. Copper, lighter undertones, fawn spots, and a white tail tip. Smells a bit like spring dew and rainstorms. RSA stood up in his excitement as he spoke. Loon thought about it for a moment, but then nodded. Palin, you bastard, RSA said as he turned around and started to pace, tears in his eyes. Loon watched him, a bit surprised, but also confused. Loon, can you find him? Set something up for us to leave and get far away from here. Talon stood and put his hand on Loon's shoulder. Loon looked up into Talon's face and thought, I can try, Talon. It did not take Loon more than 3 nights to locate Balin and set up for their escape from the pack. On the 4th night, after Talon being stripped of his rank, they were sneaking off to become renegades. Balin laughed softly as Loonson finished his story. Say looked like he had seen a ghost when he saw me, Bay teased as he looked at Say. Say snorted and shrugged. I was told you were killed. Of course I was surprised. They both laughed and looked at Alicia, her eyes locked on Loon. Has it been better, Loon? She asked softly, her voice gentle and almost motherly. Loon's gaze rose to meet hers, and he smiled lazily. Yes, I have friends now. We are family, and I do love them, he said confidently. As he spoke, Talon looked at him, his eyes tearing up slightly. He gently pet Loon's leg and looked away, trying to regain his composure. Alicia smiled softly and looked at Talon. Don't look at me. My story is pretty much well covered by Loonson, he said as he waved Allie off. She laughed and glanced back at Loon, who was getting comfortable in his chair again. Everything? Balin asked. Talon thought for a minute, then nodded. My days were pretty uniform. Anything abnormal will probably be covered by Parker. He glanced over at his brother, whom glared at him venomously. Will this story cover how you got the name Parker? Alicia asked as she curled her knees to her chest and looked at Say with sweet eyes. Say's face went a bit rosier than normal, and he smiled. It can, he said as he sat up more to start speaking. I was selected by Balin to be his apprentice, along with 2 or 3 others. Apprenticeship was pretty standard. I traveled a lot in both our world and others, but it all changed after you were proclaimed dead, Miss Alicia. She killed the Alphas? Arcee's mother asked softly. It was a surprise to the family to have their second son home again when he was supposed to be some faraway world learning about cultures for peace and trade of the Vargin packs. Yes, we were on Rodlis when we were ordered to come back, Arcee said in a quiet tone. He felt awkward, talking to his parents about this. The news had yet to come to the coastal pack about the overthrow and death of the former high alpha female, so he was unsure if it was forbidden information to share or not. Say's parents looked at each other with uncertainty and unease. What about you? What will happen? Say's father asked. Say shrugged. I was told after the leadership change has taken effect, we will be given permission to continue our jobs. He explained calmly and professionally. His parents still looked uneasy, but accepted his words. Arcee started out with just relaxing, enjoying life back at home. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into seasons, without any word about his apprenticeship, he started to help his pack more and more. Then the news came about the banishment of his mentor. Fury, rage. How could they just banish an important advisor like that? Surely the new high alpha female would need some help from those in that rank. Slowly, though, Say started to realize that all worldly travel was being restricted. Trade with other worlds was becoming less frequent. Seeing races from other countries was becoming more rare. And soon, nothing but vargin were seen in the coastal lands. A small city that was once inhabited by vargin, elves, humans, was now empty. Nothing but a ghost town, haunted by the memories of what used to take place there. Arcee would walk through the ghost town, his heart chilled by the silence. He had grown up coming here with his brother and mother. He had seen plays in the town's amphitheater, tasted foreign candies in the market, and bought beautiful jewelry in the town shops. But all of his favorite things were owned and run by world jumpers. The man that made his earrings was from Yaronit. The woman that made the sweet taffy candy was from Gaia. All of them were now no longer allowed to venture here to share their goods. Arase grew bitter. His rank was almost stripped from him, and now he wandered, unsure of really where he belonged within the pack. Some of the members still respected him. They knew what training he had been through and who his family was, but others challenged him. He often brushed off the challenges. He wasn't really a fighter after all, but a few persistent males pushed him into snapping. He soon proved he wasn't to be messed with, but he was still without a true place. His brother was a Skalat, his mother and father part of the Alpha hunting party. But what was he? He contemplated this almost every night. Despite his contemplating, trying, and fighting, Arase stayed in the same uncertain position. Seasons turned into years, and he came to accept his strange position as a random helper within the pack. Others soon accepted it as well, and things became as normal as they could, until Niland came home from the autumn festival in the valley. "Who is that?" their father asked with a slight disgusted tone as he looked at the newcomer from the distance. Arase was a bit put off by his parents' reactions to Niland's friend, but he bit his tongue. "That is my friend Lunson. He came here to be our tanner," Niland said in a very matter-of-fact voice. Their parents questioned Niland, but much to Arase's pleasure, his brother stood his ground, and they soon accepted that Lunson would be mildly associated with their family. "Irti actually let you bring him here?" Say asked with a smile. He finally got some time to spend with just his brother, no one else around. "She questioned me, but I think she understood," Tay said playfully as he tossed a stone at Say. "Well, if you think it's better for him, then..." Say shrugged and tossed a twig into the campfire that they sat around. "Isn't he a bit crazy?" Say asked after a moment of thought. Niland frowned. "Not crazy," he snapped. Say recoiled. I'm sorry. Niland smiled as Say apologized, but shrugged it off. "Scarred is a better term," he finally said, making Say smile. "You're such a softie. How did you become a Skalat?" Winter came to an end, as did another year. Spring started, and little did Arase know, a new chapter was about to start as well. The silver-haired young man sat around the normal campfire with his brother, the sun setting in the distance. The two of them bantered as they normally did, catching up on each other's lives and thoughts. Arase was in the middle of a sentence when he noticed the coastal alpha female, Irti, walking towards them with her trail and guard male with her. He stood up, then lowered his head as she approached, which made Niland turn in surprise. "Irti, my dear!" He almost purred to the golden-haired vargin woman. Her golden eyes were filled with pain as she watched him bow his head in her greeting. But she said nothing. Niland stood up taller, his face slowly going darker as he looked at the alpha female. What's wrong, love?" he said as he stepped closer to Irti, but the guard stepped forward, making Niland freeze. "I was discussing the matter of your proposal," Irti stated. Arase about choked. Proposal? He knew that Tay was close to the alpha female, but proposal? "When startling information arose," Irti continued. Her golden eyes were sharp, but held a torn pain in them. "It was brought to my attention that you lack confidence, lack support for our high alpha female," she said, almost choking on her own words. "I am the alphas of this tribe, and I cannot have a Skalat, let alone a mate, that does not support our whole race." She held her hand up and dropped a soul gem necklace, the symbol of bonding often used for proposals, onto the sandy ground. "You are also relieved of your duty as Skalat. You will no longer hold rank as an alpha citizen." She trailed off, her eyes watching him for a moment, but then turned and walked off without a second glance over her shoulder. RSA's chest went tight as he watched her walk off. Slowly, he stepped forward to his brother. Talon, he said softly. Talon's eyes were low, brows furrowed. Slowly, the dusty-haired brother shook his head and sighed heavily. No, not right now, Say. Can we just sit by the fire? RSA leaned back in the chair that he sat in front of. That was the night we found out Balin was in the area, and we left a few days later. I was really hoping you'd leave that part out, Talon hissed softly as he glanced at his brother. RSA looked at Talon and shrugged. It's part of the story, and it's a bit of important information about you, Talon. RSA snapped back. Lunson's hand slid down to Talon's shoulder, and he leaned forward. You almost became the coastal alpha male. Why would you not tell me that? Loon's voice was slightly hurt. Talon glanced over his shoulder at Loon. Because it wasn't important. I didn't want to tell anyone until I'd gotten an answer from her. Plus, I wasn't confident in the choice from the beginning. Tay's voice was gentle as he spoke to Loon, trying to redeem himself. Loon frowned and nodded slightly, clearly not convinced, but dropping the subject. Alicia glanced at the three boys, grinning a bit. She needed to change the situation. Our land, she said warmly, her voice holding a musical tone. Goosebumps formed on Say's arms as she spoke, and he smiled at her. It wasn't even his real name, yet his heart raced when she said it to him. That did not tell me how you got the nickname Parker, she said in a soft, scolding tone. Arsay felt his cheeks go warm as he lowered his gaze, smiling like a smitten child. Wasn't that our first jump as a pack? Loon asked, his attention snagged by the blushing Say. Arsay nodded. Yeah, we went to Gaia first. The jump was an easy one, especially for Balin and Arsay. The others were a little drained, but Gaia was an easy world to get to. Now, Gaia is inhabited mostly by humans, Balin explained as he pulled a few hats out of a bag. He grabbed a few things from the last town they had ventured in for preparation. These humans are not used to seeing other non-human races, Arsay said as Balin gave Talon a hat and turned to hide his own tail into his jeans. They had already changed into clothes that would be viewed as acceptable for this world, and it was just time for the fine details. So, no ears, no tail. Try not to use your native tongue, and for God's sake, no shifting. He pointed at Makota, who shied away from his finger. The others nodded. Lastly, try to use human names. I am now Bailey. Makota is Mo. Lunsen, you will go by Luke, Talon, Taylor, and RSA will be Aaron. Got it? Once again, they all nodded. Once they got their bearings, Balin led them to the small rural town in search of food and a room to stay in. RSA was excited. He hadn't jumped to any world in years, and to come to Gaia was fantastic. They had some of the best suites and the most comfortable clothing. Speaking of, Say slowed his pace, his attention grabbed by a window looking into a shop. A fake person, what were those called again? Mannequins? Yes, mannequin, was dressed in nice jeans and a fancy red leather jacket. He smiled as he wondered if he could wear such a jacket. Excuse me. A giggling voice made him jump slightly and turn to look at a young adult human girl with her two friends. Say's face instantly brightened and he smiled back to them. Hello there, he almost purred out as he looked each of the girls over. They all giggled and muttered to each other slyly before the first girl looked back at him with rosy cheeks. Has anyone ever told you how sexy you are? She said in a flirtatious tone. Almost instantly, RSA grew flustered. He had always been used to mindlessly flirting with others, but not being flirted with. I'm Annie. What's your name? She asked as she leaned towards him. Damn it! What was the name Balin gave him? Think, RSA, think. His eyes danced around, looking for something. anything to remind him of his assigned name. The only thing he could see was a sign reading Parker's Homestyle Cafe. "Parker!" he finally burst out nervously. All the girls giggled together just as Say felt a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Parker." He turned to see Balin frowning. Bye, he said to the 3 girls as they waved. "We weren't on Gaia for even an hour," Balin barked through his laughter. Everyone was laughing at the short story, which made Bekah bury his head under Balin's arm with a groan. "And the name just stuck?" Alicia asked through her laughter. Arcee shrugged. "It's a good name," he said back to her, his nose wrinkling up slightly. "Makes you sound like an innocent child." Alicia's eyes looked him over in a teasing manner, making him lean forward as if ready to challenge her. "I am a very innocent child." At his words, the rest of the bachelor pack burst. They all laughed themselves to the point of tears, waking Bekah up in the process. The youngest vargin sat up, his eyes half-lidded, and a look of irritation on his features. The pack slowly calmed themselves down, and Balin stood up. "We should let Miss Alicia sleep," Balin said as he pulled Bekah to his feet. The youngster grumbled something under his breath, then smiled to Allie. "Thank you for food and the flight, Miss Allie," he said as he yawned. Alicia stood up, smiling at the young man. "Go get some sleep, my love," she said softly as she put a hand on his sleepy face. Bekah smiled, rubbed his face into her hand. He then turned and led the way through the house to the front door. Balin watched him, smiling, then looked back at Alicia. "Thank you," he said warmly. Alicia stepped to him and wrapped her arms around his neck. At first, Balin's face went red, but he soon calmed and pressed his nose into her hair as friends often did in their customs. "I will see you guys probably tomorrow," she smiled as she released him. Balin nodded and turned as he heard the front door opening. He nodded to Alicia before hurrying after Bekah. "Food was awesome," Talon said with a smile as he stretched and started to give his appreciation to their host. Alicia smiled and shrugged. She motioned Tay to step closer. He obeyed without hesitation and was surprised to have her arms go around his neck in a hug, but then she pulled him lower so that she could whisper to him. "My mate-to-be also abandoned me. I promise you, you will heal and find your Ritakosha. I promise you, it will be worth it in the end." She released him, and Tay felt tears in his eyes. "Thank you. Really," he said softly. Just as he lowered himself into a small bow to her, Lunson climbed onto his back and rested his chin on Tay's shoulder. He smiled contentedly as Tay secured his grasp on Loon's legs. "Warning, Loon!" he barked before striding down the hall. Alicia watched the awkward pair, then turned to look at Arcee as he tried to slip by. "Will you freak out if I hug you?" she said as she put an arm out, cutting him off. Arcee's cheeks went red, as did the inside of his ears, and he looked at her with mildly terrified look. "No," he said simply in a tiny voice, his face still horrified. "Why would I freak out?" he said a bit louder, his nervousness clear. Alicia smiled and put her hand under his chin. She clearly was enjoying the torment she was dishing out. All right, maybe a little," Arcee stammered as her hand touched his cheek, which only made her smile more. "Good," she said simply as she stood up on her toes and let her lips gently brush against his cheek. When she dropped back to her flat feet and released his chin, Arcee just stared at her, his face burning like 1,000 suns. "You..." He paused, suddenly forgetting what he was about to say. Alicia laughed softly with raised brows. The silver-haired man laughed, inhaling deeply, bowed lower than what was reasonable, then turned and walked out without another word. Alicia followed him down the hall and watched as he quickly walked outside and gently shut the door behind him. "Ah!" The sound started quiet, almost like a whine, but turned into a loud yell. A bit concerned, Alicia peered sneakily out the window just in time to see RSA flailing and dancing as he followed his brother down the street. She let out a heavy sigh and smiled. She loved these boys.